Hello, and welcome to the Back to School trainings for the 23-24 school year. I'm Jennifer Stafford, the Director in the Division of Assessment and Accountability Support. Helen Jones, the Academic Program Manager, and I will be presenting to you the Kentucky's School Accountability System and look at the various ways that the accountability system is going to be reported. Looking at the agenda, we'll start with the implementation of Senate Bill 158 from the 2020 General Assembly and General Session. We'll dive into the state accountability for the 2022-2023 school year that will be reported in the fall of 23. We're going to implement the status and the new component of change at this time, and there's some differences that change brings to the accountability system. So we're going to dive into how change impacts both state accountability and federal classifications. At that point, Helen will take over and talk about the upcoming 2023 accountability standard setting that has to take place before we get to fall reporting. And then she'll finally end with some assessment and accountability resources that I think that you'll find useful. So looking at Senate Bill 158, 2020, it will first have its full implementation based on the 2023 fall reporting. Kentucky's accountability system 703 KAR 5:270 became effective November 30th, 2021. And as you recall, we were in the middle of the pandemic in 2021. So this is the first time that all of the system will be implemented. So in that bill from 2020, there was an exclusive list of indicators that are based on status and change. That exclusive list includes indicators for state assessment results in reading and math, science, social studies, and writing, progress on English language proficiency, the quality of school climate and safety survey, as well as at the high school, post-secondary readiness and graduation rate. That does include the 4 and 5 year rate. Now, each of these indicators will be based on status, which is what we've always had in Kentucky. We just didn't call it status, but since we've had school accountability, status has been reported because it was the current year performance. So the current year would be the 2022-2023 school year. And then it brings in this change element, which is the difference between the prior year and the current year status score. So for the 22-23 school year, we're going to look back at status from 22 and compare that to the status of all of these indicators in 2023. So that's the difference. We're looking at the performance from one year to the next, which brings about almost double the amount of information that we've always had in school accountability. Once we get the indicators, then all of those indicators that the school has are combined to an overall performance rating for state accountability. And we're going to look at how that impacts federal accountability as well. Now, that overall designation will be reported as colors using 5 different color levels. At each of the levels, elementary, middle, and high, there will be a range from blue to red performance levels. Now, to get to that overall performance rating, we'll have to first start with indicator performance and status and change. Now, the colors are for state reporting, and as you can see here from this elementary and middle school example, the overall performance will be presented using a dial that will indicate the color for that overall performance by school level. So in this elementary and middle school example, you can see that the indicator performance will be based on that exclusive list of indicators. For elementary and middle school, it's state assessment results in reading and math, science, social studies, and writing, English language proficiency, and the quality of school climate and safety survey. So the indicator performance level will also be reported as a color as well. Now, status and change will have a little bit more descriptive. It will have colors, but it will also have descriptive words. So status will be reported for each level from very high to very low, and change will be reported from increase significantly to decline significantly. Now, these colors are for reporting, but they don't tell a whole lot until you get to the scores for each of those. So the overall performance level of that color doesn't give you a whole lot of information, but you have to dig deeper into the indicator performance ratings and that change and status elements of the accountability system to really see what's happening within your school. So the colors give an overall kind of quick glance at the school performance, but doesn't give the complete picture. You have to look deeper into the data and what's happening at those performance levels and also those status and change indicator levels. Now, that overall performance rating that will be presented in that color will be based on the indicators at each level. Those are combined using the weights that were established by the Kentucky Board of Education. Now, you can see here that elementary, middle, and high, the percentages of each of those indicators that will be used to combine into that overall weight. In previous accountability systems, elementary and middle school weights have been the same, but this Board of Education put priority on the different levels by indicating the weights are a little bit different at each of the levels. So you can see the overall percentages and how they are different by level. Now, if a school does not have an indicator, then the weights will be distributed proportionally to the remaining indicators. So for example, if an elementary school doesn't have a population of 30 English learners, they would not have that English learner progress indicator. So that 5% of that weight of the English learner indicator would be redistributed proportionally to the other three indicators. Now let's look at an example of how the overall performance is scored. The overall performance, again, combines all of the indicators at the levels. So behind all of the reporting of colors, there are scores behind each of those. So when we combine the scores for each of the indicators, we take the scores for the indicator times the percentage that the Kentucky Board of Education has established and add that to the other scores multiplied by the weights and add all of those together to get that overall performance score. Now, you can see here on this elementary school example, the indicator weights of the science, social studies, and combined writing is at 0.4 or 40%. Reading and math is 51%. English learner, again, is 5%, and the quality school climate and safety survey is 4%. So we take all of those, multiply them by the weights, add them together, and get that combined overall performance score. Now, the calculation for status and change for each of the components of status and change has not been established yet. And currently, we are working with our psychometricians at the Center for Assessment and the U.S. Department of Education on getting approval of that calculation for status and change and how to establish those calculations. So once we have those calculations and those have been approved, then we'll be able to share that with you as well as move into the standard setting activity that will happen this fall. And Helen's going to tell you a little bit more about that one. Now, behind all of these uh, indicators and status, they have to be combined using the different weights for that overall performance at each of the levels. So in this middle school example, you'll see the only change here is the weight at the different indicators. And at high school, again, it's the same kind of calculation, bringing the indicator performance scores together to get that overall performance score. But we've added the post-secondary readiness and graduation rate at high school. And again, that status and change calculation has not been established yet. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the colors will be reported, but all of those scores are behind these color ratings. So to get to the color ratings, there is this table that has been established by the Kentucky Board of Education. Each of the indicators, again, will have those scores behind it, but be reported using a color. And how that color will be determined is bringing together those standard setters that are going to establish what it means for a school to be in these different categories. Our standard setters are going to come together and look at the ranges of scores, and they will determine the cut points or make some recommendations around these cut points for what it means for each school to be either declined significantly, declined, maintained, increased, or increased significantly for change. They'll also revisit the status that was established in the summer of 2022 and possibly have adjustments to that status and what it means to be from very low to very high in status. So we had status established in 2022. The standard setters are going to revisit what status looks like and see if that status component still stands for the performance of our schools in 2023. So there could be adjustments to the status from 22 to 23 for this accountability standard setting, but there may not. So that's to be determined by the standard setting committee. So once the standard setting committee has determined the ranges of what it means to be in these different categories for status and change, then the schools will receive these color ratings based on the combination of status and change for each indicator. So, for example, in reading and math, the state indicator for science for reading and math, for the 22-23 school year, if the school had a high status, so that current year performance, so think spring 23 for the 22-23 school year. So if the high status and they maintained that high status from the year before, then you would go across the row of high status until you got to the column of change maintained, and you would see that indicator would be reported as green. So again, there are numbers behind each of these rows and columns that the standard setters will make recommendations, and then the approval of those recommendations will be by the local superintendent advisory council and the Kentucky Department of Education. Now let's look at federal classification for the 22-23 school year. The U.S. Department of Education is interested in states supporting the lowest performing schools as well as the schools that have the lowest performing student demographic groups. So annually, the targeted support and improvement identification is made. For this fall, for the 2023 identification will be based on 2 consecutive years of data. So that'll be the 21-22 and 22-23 school year. The next identification of CSI, which is Comprehensive Support and Improvement, will be in the fall of 2025. Each year, we'll have to run the system to identify the lowest 5% of schools, because each year we'll want to identify those schools that are currently identified with federal classifications and see if they have progress enough to exit the federal classification. So now let's take a little bit deeper look into the change element in the statute. As I mentioned, Senate Bill 158 dramatically changed school accountability, but let's look a little bit deeper into the actual statute itself, because there's a little bit of difference in the identification of the bottom 5%. For those of you that have been around a while, we had systems in previous accountability models that had state accountability that were separate from federal accountability. In the most recent accountability models, we've really combined and tried to have state accountability and federal accountability mean the same thing or have the same calculations and same systems. However, Senate Bill 158 changed that. So looking specifically at the language within the statute, it says status and change shall receive equal weight determining the overall performance for all students as a group and separately for individual groups. Status shall be determined by using the current year performance, and change shall be determined by using the difference between performance from the prior to the current year. Except change shall be based on the difference in performance for the prior 3 years for the purpose of determining the lowest performing 5% of schools under the subsections within that act. So you can see here by statute, the federal accountability and identification of that lowest 5% uses 3 years of change data. For the 22-23 school year, this is the first year that we have change. So this is the first year we don't have 3 years of change. So this year, for the identification of the system and running the system to identify if the CSI or TSI schools have exited or no longer meet that criteria, it will be the same data for state accountability and federal accountability. However, beginning in the 23-24 school year, we will have a different calculation that will be used for state accountability and then determining that bottom 5%. Now, the data for using that 5% will have different information and will be presented in data sets, but not using any type of colors. So the separate calculation for that overall performance in federal classification will begin in the 23-24 school year. So the school year that we're starting will use multiple years of change data for the federal classifications. So this year we'll have all the same status score, change score, indicator score, everything will be the same between state and federal classification using the same calculation. Beginning next year, with determining the bottom 5% for federal classification, the second year of change data will be included for that bottom 5%. So the importance here is the fact that the bottom 5% is calculated annually to assign those federal classifications and determine whether schools meet the exit criteria or not. So let's look now at the calculations and the data that will be coming in on a manner that progressively uses more change data. So for the 22-23 school year, we only have 1 year of change data, so it'll be the same for state and federal classifications. However, beginning next year, for state accountability, it's status in current year compared to change from the prior year, just from 1 year to the next. But for federal identifications of the bottom 5%, we'll use 2 years of change data. The following year, the following year, 24-25, we'll use 3 years of change data. So we'll progressively get more change data as we have more years of the system. We'll turn now to Helen Jones, who's going to bring us more information about that upcoming Standard Setting Committee, fall reporting of 2023, and more accountability resources for you. Helen?
Thank you, Jennifer. My name is Helen Jones, and I am the Academic Program Manager in the Division of Assessments and Accountability Support. I'm going to discuss the 2023 standard setting and the 2023 fall reporting with you today. Before we discuss the 2023 standard setting, let's look back at the process to implement status in 2022. In September 2022, the Kentucky Department of Education and the Office of Assessments and Accountability partnered with the Center for Assessments and who facilitated the standard setting process. The department convened a 26-member panel of stakeholders with which represented a broad group of persons and organizations with different knowledge to be involved in this which are involved in Kentucky's accountability system. This process took place, the standard setting took place over 1.5 days. The panelists were placed in groups to allow for some table discussion as well as some independent work. The panelists reviewed and revised performance level descriptors for the indicator and the overall. So they were tasked with to establish the performance rating through multi-round process. Round one allowed the individuals to conduct some independent ratings, and then followed by some table discussion and group discussion. They reviewed the data just as a reference point to make sure they were on task. Round two, the group adjusted if supported by 2/3 of the group. The panelists used the same process to establish school's overall performance rating, which is status, through a multi-round process. Again, they did independent work, reviewed the data, discussion, and then made adjustments based on the vote of the group, 2/3 vote of the group. The standard setting concluded with having the panelists complete the meeting evaluation and documentation of outcomes. Following the standard setting event, KDE and the Center of Assessment staff met with local Superintendent Advisory Council, or LSAC, to review and present the recommendations from the standard setting panelists for approval, which KDE and LSAC approved the recommendation. Based on the process from the 22 standard setting, the agency learned some valuable lessons. For instance, this is a very complex process, which means time is needed to understand the complexity and the scope of the task as outlined in the regulations. Therefore, KDE decided to build in sufficient time for preparation, training, and support. KDE understood the need for very clear and coherent indicator performance level descriptors and school performance level descriptors. To ensure credibility support, the panelists should reflect a balanced representation of participants. KDE and OAA also committed to allowing for ample time for discussion and judgment. People felt rushed. That's one of the things that we heard from both LSAC as well as the panelists. They felt rushed. They needed time to just really think through the process. The credibility of the process is paramount. Individuals were willing to accept the committee's recommendation because they respected the process. It provided LSAC some time to review the recommendations prior to making its judgment. As a result of the lessons learned from the feedback from the 22 standard setting, the agency worked with the Center for Assessments to facilitate feedback from our policymakers. The work for the 22 standard setting began early in the year. The initial work began in January, part of February, by taking feedback from the Kentucky TAC Council, which is our advisory council for our assessment and accountability. In March, OAA and the center saw policy guidance. During one of LSAC's meetings, the center posed questions to gather guidance for the accountability standard setting for the upcoming year. So keep in mind, we still had to implement, we're still in the process of implementing the full accountability system, which includes change. So KDE went to LSAC to get some guidance on what they would like to see. Therefore, in April, LSAC decided they wanted to collect some additional feedback from other superintendents whom they represent and use this to provide input to KDE for the guidance in the standard setting. In May, OAA met with LSAC to revisit those key questions and review feedback that they may have obtained from their constituents and the superintendents they represent. They confirmed the standard setting approach, and also LSAC identified 2 LSAC members to participate in the standard setting. And these were the same 2 members which participated in the 2022 standard setting for status. In keeping with the history of setting accountability performance standards through an open process that involves a broad group of stakeholders, the 2022 committee consisted of 29 member panels, with a diverse background from different geographic regions of Kentucky, serving in the districts, schools, and the community. Most of the panelists are returning from the 2022. People who were involved, the panelists that were involved in the standard setting, recognized the importance of the work and wanted to be a part of the continuing part of this process. The task of the committee is to set the cut scores for the components of the accountability system and to define what is good enough in terms of performance. For each grade, the committee has to determine what are the cuts for the 5 levels of status. That's from very high to very low. They had to then determine the cuts for the 5 levels of change, which is new this year. And that is increase significantly to decline significantly, as well as to set the overall performance rating by grade span for the 5 levels. Because again, now we are combining status and change to get that overall performance. So those are 5 levels. What are those cuts to go from blue to red? The committee determined what are the cuts for the 5 levels of status, very high to very low. And they will determine what are the cuts for change. So the committee is to set the cut scores for the components of the accountability system. The 2023 committee in June drafted the school performance level descriptors. The next step will be to set the cut scores for full implementation using 2 years of data. They will then look at the standard setting process will set for status and change, again, from very high to very low for status, as well as change levels will be declined significantly through increase significantly, and determine the overall performance rating or the color for each indicator. The scores will be aggregated based on all available indicators. When I say all available indicators, will the school have enough student demographic group if the N level meets the requirements for the accountability system? Now, this is a multi-step process. So in June, we talked about what the committee did. They developed those performance level descriptors. The next step that will take place, they will come back together in September. The dates are listed here. We were going to do it over 2 days. We go from the 13th through the 15th, giving them the time to looking at the data to set the cut scores for status and change labels. And also they're going to be required to determine the overall school performance rating. So that step will take place September 13th through the 15th. Following that, based on those recommendations for those cut scores and those performance level descriptors, KDE and OAA, along with the Center for Assessment, will go back to LSAC and Kentucky Department of Education to present the recommendation of the panel. Based on the approval of LSAC and KDE, we will then move into the next step, which is our quality control day and public reporting. So all of these steps so that we have to complete the standard setting process before we can ever get to the public reporting of our data. So let's talk about what happens once that step is taken place. So for fall reporting to take place, these are some of the things that the districts will receive. So currently, there are some data that the district should already have. You should already have this data in your district. So you should have the data for access and alternate access. Those tests were administered in early spring of 2023. You should also have the data for ACT, which is the American College Testing. So you should have the data for your students that took the ACT, all of your 11th grade students that took the ACT. You should have your kindergarten screening data from last year, from last fall, when the kindergartners were screened. You should also have the post-secondary readiness data. That data should already be in your district. Coming shortly, you should also have at this point in early August, we're hoping to release the student data for the students that took the alternate Kentucky Summative Assessments as well as KSA. So let's just take a quick look at the standard setting and reporting timeline. So we'll have fall data review, which began August 2nd, and it will go through the 10th. The district assessment coordinators will review the data, looking at the demographics and for accountability. This is an opportunity that you'll have in terms of this is their first look to start that process for reporting. Keep in mind, all of these are the steps that will lead to that public reporting. The next step that will take place is the standard setting. As we said earlier, the dates for the standard setting is scheduled for September 13th through the 15th. This is where we will bring in our stakeholders to basically set those cut scores. And this includes 2 members of the local superintendent advisory committee. The next step that will happen after the standard setting, we will take that information, the recommendations from the standard setting committee back to LSAC, and this should take place in early October. And based on what the recommendations of the standard setting committee is, they will present that information to LSAC. LSAC and KDE will have an opportunity to approve the recommendations of the committee and therefore set the cut scores for the accountability system. Following that process, the approval process, KDE anticipates having a quality control day. We've done this in the past where the schools and districts have another look at their data to verify that there are no systemic issues. And to just make sure when we talk about systemic issues, what we are looking for is when you're looking at your demographic groups, do you have all of your students, all of your EL students are there? Or are they missing? So those are the systemic issues that we will be looking for during the quality control day. So that will take place after the meeting with LSAC. Who will see the data will again be our district assessment coordinators, because you will be able to take a look at that and verify again that there are no systemic issues. Given all of that, if our quality control day goes well, the next step will be the actual public reporting, which will take place in late October and early November. This is a little later this year because we understand that we've got to make sure that we get this right. Because once we set these cut scores, they will be in place for hopefully the next 6 years. Following public reporting, then there will be the release in the school report cards. So the public will be able to see how our students did, how our students performed, and the overall accountability will be reported in the school report card. The next things that we want to make sure of, we want to provide you with some resources. So we have here the Accountability at a Glance. That's a document that we created last year. We hope that it benefits you. We have now included a document that is the Summer 2023 Assessments and Accountability Activities. It just basically outlines all of the activities that have taken place this summer, the work that has been going on here in the agency to help you and support you. And hopefully it will be a great tool for you as well. As always, we are here to support you. So if you need any of us, we have here all of the members of the Division of Assessments and Accountability Support, along with our emails. So you can reach out to us by email if you need us. Don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are here to support you. Listed here are some additional back to school trainings that will be beneficial for you. We hope that you will take the opportunity to see these as a resource and utilize those as a reference throughout the school year. I want to take, on behalf of the Department of Education, the Office of Assessments and Accountability, and the Division of Assessments and Accountability Support, we want to say how much we appreciate all the work that you do. We hope that you have a good year. Just know that we are here in partnership with you, and anything that you may need, do not hesitate to reach out to us. You have our contact information. You can reach out to us via email or phone anytime. We're here for you. Have a great year. Thank you.